virtual space. First of all, if you did not purchase a copy of Saving Yellowstone with your you can visit countrybookshelf.com to make that purchase at any time. We'll be dropping a few links in the chat throughout the. Are also live streaming this event on YouTube and recording it. So if conversation and at a later date, you can always visit us there, and you can also find other videos and conversations on that site. If you have any questions for our authors or in the Q&A, and we'll get to those after the end of the evening. And if you run into any tech issues, the first, then if you have any challenges re-entering, you can, we want to remind everybody that this is a shared creative space, and we want to remain safe for all who join us today. Offensive, inappropriate comments or questions, we will dismiss those users from the space. Now on to some of the fun part. Megan Kate Nelson is here with us. She is a writer and historian living in Lincoln, Massachusetts. She has written about the Civil War, U.S. Western history, and American culture of for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Smithsonian Magazine, Preservation Magazine, History and Literature from Harvard University, and her PhD in American Studies from the University of Iowa. And she has taught at Texas Tech, Harvard, and Brown. Nelson is the author of Saving Yellowstone, The Three-Cornered War, Ruined Nation, and Trembling Earth. Kerri Keller Clement is a postdoc at the University of Idaho, Department of History, where she specializes in the history of zootonic animals, indigenous settlers, lands in Montana and Yellowstone regions in the 20th century. More broadly, her research themes include agricultural and environmental history, critical indigenous studies, animal history, digital humanities, and national park history. She has received fellowships and grants from Newberry Library, Montana Historical Society, the Consortium for History of Science, Technology, and Medicine, and the Charles Reed Center for Western Studies, among others. Originally from Montana, she can be found on the river or on a ski slope most weekends. Ladies, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Mel, and thanks to Country Bookshelf for hosting this event tonight. I am coming to you from Pawtucket, Massachusetts, and Agawam lands, and I am so happy to have Kerri with me here tonight. Kerri played a pivotal role in the research for Saving Yellowstone because she went to the Yellowstone National Park archives for me when I could not during the pandemic. So, and got a hold of, took some photos of a very important diary that plays a strong role in the book. So thank you for being here with me, Kerri, and doing this event.
Oh, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for the kind words. I'm not sure how pivotal it was, but I sure enjoyed sort of getting a window into your own research process and some of the sources you were looking at for this book as well. So I guess that actually brings up one of the questions that I wanted to talk to you about tonight, if you just want to go ahead and jump in. But one of the questions I had that I was really interested to hear your perspective on is, what surprised you the most while you were doing this research, particularly in reference to sources, but then also just more broadly, what was the biggest surprise?
I mean, I think when historians always set out on a project, there's always a lot of surprises in store, right? Because your research will sort of take a turn. People will fall kind of in and out of the picture. And initially I went into the project thinking it would be the story of kind of Eastern powers that be, not only the scientific world, but the investment banking world, also the museum world of the Smithsonian, and the popular culture world of Scribner's Magazine and sort of magazine culture. And so, and also, the politics of radical Reconstruction and the Republican Party during this period. And for the most part, that was true. But then I also really started to focus more on the situation on the ground in the Yellowstone Basin, and then also in the Yellowstone Valley. And that's when Tatanka Iyatake, or Sitting Bull, came into the picture quite strongly for me as part of the project. Initially, he was not a protagonist. And so that, I think, it's a good lesson for historians to learn, and for anyone embarking on a book project, that sometimes you'll start with a certain picture in your mind of how the book is going to go, and then it'll end up in a very different place, and that's fine. That is exactly how it's supposed to go. You're supposed to make these discoveries, and I was really just constantly amazed at how much Ferdinand Hayden and Jay Cook and Sitting Bull, who were kind of the three main protagonists in the book, how much their worlds were in circulation in and around one another. And I think that's, obviously Hayden and Cook knew each other quite well. Cook and Sitting Bull became antagonists, never met. And then the connection between Sitting Bull and Hayden was a little bit more tenuous. Like, I'm not really sure that Sitting Bull knew that Hayden was kind of in the picture. I mean, Hayden was certainly aware of Sitting Bull, and in fact, after 2 trips to Yellowstone, had to change his plans and instead conduct surveys in Colorado because of Lakota actions in the Yellowstone Valley. He wasn't sure that he could get his team there because of that. So all of those connections were really interesting to me, and I was surprised by their interconnectedness and the ways that their lives kind of overlapped with one another.
Yeah, that's something that I really appreciated in reading Saving Yellowstone, which I enjoyed immensely.
Thank you.
What I was struck by the networks, as you were describing them, between all of the characters within your book. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how one writes about those connections, and then how one writes about writing historical characters too.
Yeah, this was a real change for me, because my first 2 books were very academic in nature. The first was my dissertation, which I then turned into a book. And then my first Civil War book, Ruined Nation, was also very academically structured, in the sense that it was argument driven. Each chapter kind of stood on its own. You could pull it out and teach it just kind of whole cloth, because it had all the arguments in it. It set up everything very nicely, all wrapped into a neat little package. And so when I went to write The Three-Cornered War, I really wanted to change the way that I was writing history. And so I stole a strategy from fiction writers, a multi-perspective narrative, and basically wrote 9 mini biographies in Three-Cornered War, and kind of treated them as such, really kind of delved into each person and their lives, and then tracked them through the Southwest over time. And so I did the same for Saving Yellowstone, except with many fewer people. But it was the same kind of strategy. And it's a different mode of historical research and historical writing, because you're not as, or at least I was not as concerned with just compiling evidence, to prove an argument. Like, oh, I'm going to, like when I was writing Ruined Nation, I was like, okay, I'm going to talk about the destruction of trees. Okay, now I'm going to read as many Civil War diaries and letters as I possibly can, and, military records, orders. I'm going to look at images and see how many references I can find to destroyed trees. And then I'm going to compile them all together. And then I'm going to create an argument out of that. Here, and in Saving Yellowstone, with the story of Ferdinand Hayden, for example, my job was to kind of put readers on the ground with him as he's conceptualizing the idea to go to Yellowstone, as he lobbies for money from Congress. And then as he gets his team together, goes to Omaha, gets on the train, gets off at Ogden, and then starts moving north through northern Utah and Idaho, and comes into Yellowstone through that northern entrance at Gardner. And on the way, stops in Bozeman and Fort Ellis to get his military detail. And so my job there was not necessarily to just get, say, okay, he's taking the train. How many references to the train can I get from all of these records? But really to build a sense for the reader of what it was like to be on that train, and what it was like for Hayden to lead this really large survey where he had never been in control of such a large group of people before. He had never directed an expedition of that size, and with such an array of people. The challenges for him as he was doing it, the excitement that he felt to be taking on this role, and the real ambition that was driving him, right? Because he saw Yellowstone as the way to make his reputation, right? So it was a different kind of experience in the writing of it than my previous academic books. And that meant really delving into the research and reading through as many of his own letters and his own words that I could find, so I could get a sense of his voice. But also to just be really focused on the story itself, on kind of moving him through space and time, while also bringing in the arguments about what he was doing there, why Yellowstone was important at this moment, why, Republicans would care in this moment when they're trying to bring the South back into the Union politically, when they're trying to get a handle on all the racial violence going on in the South. Why are they even focused on the West? Why would they give Hayden that much money in their final session? And why would they be so interested in what he found there? I mean, those were the sort of questions that were driving it. But my strategy for kind of communicating those arguments and communicating his experience on the ground, and along with the experiences of Cook and Sitting Bull, were quite different, but very fun. Like, I really enjoy this kind of narrative writing. And I wrote most of the book in the pandemic. And so it was really actually kind of great to be able to transport myself through the writing and through my own imagination, since no one could travel in that first initial phase. And I was really writing the book through kind of March of 2021. So, pretty much we were all stuck. And so to be able to go there in my imagination and to really kind of have that experience through the writing was actually really nice during the pandemic. I know that sounds sort of weird, like I'm teleporting to Yellowstone, but I was so disappointed not to be able to go and do the research at the archives there and to drive around myself. And so it was the next best thing to actually put it all down on the page.
Yeah, I appreciated some of the environmental descriptions that you gave, including around the travel around railroads, but then also how Indigenous peoples were interacting with the railroads and interacting with some of these surveys and the U.S. Army and the U.S. Cavalry. Can you talk a little bit about, because that is always a thing that is, at least I've seen in the past with some of other past works, is it can be hard to balance the story of Yellowstone with the story of and bring Indigenous people into the picture, as well as the greater history of the United States in terms of Reconstruction. Can you sort of talk a little bit about why that was important to you, as well. And yeah, so talk about why that was important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you heard from Mel at the beginning, kind of introducing the traditional land statement and the land acknowledgement, I mean, just a huge number of indigenous nations were there, and are still here, right?
Yeah.
In the Yellowstone region, and used Yellowstone in a variety of ways, as a thoroughfare, as a hunting ground, as a campsite, and then the band of Shoshone, known as the Sheep Eater, and I think it's either Tukadeka or Tudadeka Shoshone, lived in Yellowstone, lived in the mountains, and herded sheep there. So this was an indigenous space, and and Hayden knew it. Right. Like this is the reason he took a detail from Fort Ellis, because he was anticipating running into indigenous people in the basin. He was anticipating pushback and possible attacks. They had already engaged with Ute peoples and Shoshone peoples on the way, and Shoshone Bannock peoples on their way up, and had done some trading with them. And one of Hayden's jobs in his orders was to make note of indigenous peoples in the region. And the orders are very vague. They're like, for the use of this government, right? But really it's for the use of the US Army, like to know who is where. And for me, this story, I mean, it's about Reconstruction America, and Reconstruction America is not only about the North and the South, but it's about the North and the South and the West. And US Indian policy changes dramatically during this period. And Native peoples are asserting themselves in this region in some unprecedented ways during this period. So I felt this was an important story to tell. Once I figured out that Sitting Bull was actively preventing Jay Cooke from laying down the tracks of the Northern Pacific by pushing his surveyors out in 71, 72, and 73. And Cooke was very interested also in Hayden's expedition and what he was finding in Yellowstone. He wanted to bring tourists there. And I just knew that story was important. And it was also important to realize, and I think this is a way that Three Cornered War and Saving Yellowstone are actually connected with this larger argument about how, white Americans, and particularly Republicans in the North in this period, are simultaneously fighting for Black rights in the South and fighting for Native extermination in the West. And we think of that as completely contradictory. Like, how could you possibly believe in both of these things? How could you possibly argue for both of these things? But in this moment, they had no problem holding those ideas in their heads, because they did not see those communities as the same. And they saw indigenous peoples as standing in the way. They were in the way of the American dream. They were in the way of manifest destiny. And they needed to basically push them from the country onto reservations where they would be, incarcerated and surveilled and kept out of the way. Like that was the goal. And that was all part of a larger vision, along with Black equality, of a future America of free labor and free movement for white and Black Americans. Native peoples were explicitly excluded from the 14th Amendment, not considered citizens, and not considered really even to be capable of citizenship for quite some time. So it was important to me that I tell that story in this context, not only in the context of Reconstruction history, but also in the context of Yellowstone history and National Park history. And as a non-Native historian, I also felt it was very important to privilege Indigenous sources. So if you go into my footnotes, Indigenous scholars and oral histories are always cited first. I use them as my primary pieces of evidence for these narratives, particularly of Sitting Bull, but also of Jay Cooke as well. And, there have been a lot of good histories. written from the US side, from the military side, by Robert Utley, by Pekka Hemalainen. But those I chose to kind of, they could take a backseat in this case, because it was important to have Indigenous sources highlighted and Indigenous histories as produced by those communities, really privileged in those spaces. And this is also why it was important to me to include Indigenous names in, at least in the first use and my first reference. And in some cases throughout the book, there are Lakota words for the Missouri River. There are, for various elements of the community that I use, because, those are the words that the Lakota used to describe the spaces that they were in. And I think it's important that we know those words, and that we integrate them into our larger histories of America.
Yeah, 100%. That was, I enjoyed that. It was refreshing to read something that privileges Indigenous place names and Indigenous languages, because I think it helps to center Indigenous histories and Indigenous stories in ways that are really critical and important. One of the things.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was really happy to see that in the press releases for what Yellowstone National Park is going to do for the 150th, the superintendent, Cam Shawley, has announced that there will be a much more concerted effort to work in collaboration with, I think it's the 27 tribal nations that have connections to Yellowstone. There's going to be a Crow Village installation, kind of run by Shane Doyle up at the northern entrance. And then there's going to be a Native History Center at Old Faithful, which is, I think, probably one of the most visited spots in the entire park. And that, I think, is fantastic. I think that is exactly what Yellowstone National Park should be doing. And I hope they continue to do it kind of after the 150th year. And we start to see kind of more wayfinding information, more kind of integrated Indigenous histories in all of the park, because we need to know these histories. And, I think you can have a beautiful tourist experience appreciating the wildlife and the natural wonders of Yellowstone, and simultaneously understand the complicated history that brought the park into being.
Yeah. And I am encouraged to see that those activities are taking place, especially after decades and decades of Indigenous led activism and efforts and work to get to get those activities accomplished. One of the, it was striking when I was reading your book as a Montana historian of how many names of folks who were involved in early Montana history or helped to quote unquote build Montana were in there, and often in ways that I knew, but I hadn't. I was reminded as I was going back through. So names like Sam Hauser and obviously Cook and Doan and all of those, and Langford and then Norris makes it in there, and other big names, and Helena and Bozeman, and it was striking to me the role that Montana played. The role that Montana played in both building Yellowstone, but then also the role Yellowstone played in sort of building Montana, and yet it doesn't end up in the state.
Right. They tried, though. They tried.
Yeah. So I thought it was interesting to me to see so many characters, and have them fleshed out as, and I think I said this earlier, but have them fleshed out as people in a way that oftentimes can be difficult to do in history books. And that's also, so one of the other questions I wanted to ask you is, can you tell me your favorite story that didn't make it into the book? Because obviously, there's stories about some of the men in the book that I was like, and some of the women where it was like, oh, and then, so I was curious to see what didn't make it in there that's some of your favorite stories.
Oh, gosh. Well, yeah, I mean, I had to trim down, and in many cases, I had to cut whole chapters down into only a couple of pages. So I had a whole chapter initially devoted to the KKK trials in South Carolina. I did a ton of research on where they took place, because interestingly, none of the coverage in the newspapers actually identified the building they were in. And so I went down a huge rabbit hole for about 3 days trying to figure out where they would have been located and how they're, and I'm a big fan of law dramas and like courtroom dramas. So I kind of had all of these big scenes where the US government is using the power of the Department of Justice to go after the rank and file of the KKK, and they're charging them with conspiracy to prevent Black Southerners from taking up their 14th and 15th Amendment rights. And which is just an unprecedented use of federal power to protect the nation's most vulnerable citizens, and the like of which we would not see again, really, quite frankly, until the 1960s. And I'm not sure we've really seen it fully, even now. And so I, of course, loved that. And I had this whole chapter of this courtroom drama and the trial of this rank and file Klan member and the murder of a Black Southerner who had been a militiaman and was kind of successfully farming. And I had to take that out. Basically the whole thing, basically it got condensed into about a page in the book, because when we went into editorial, my editors felt that it just was not as fully connected to the Yellowstone story as we wanted it to be, although it's the heart of the Reconstruction story, along with the Yellowstone expedition. So, I'm trying to kind of give all of this really great, rich context of Reconstruction and everything that's going on nationwide so that we can understand Yellowstone better. But that was kind of taking us a little too far away. But I still managed to get the testimony in, and was able to also highlight a Black woman's voice in the sections on that trial, and sort of the very interesting appointments that Ulysses S. Grant made during his presidency. So Grant initially was a major protagonist, and then he kind of shifted to more of a contextual figure, and the Grant administration kind of took more of a backseat because we were trying to create that frame of, the Hayden, Cook, and Sitting Bull, and using Reconstruction to understand them rather than having it be its own narrative moving along. So I had to get rid of that. I also had an entire chapter devoted to the painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone to Thomas Moran. I had a bunch of scenes of him painting in his studio in Newark, New Jersey, and Richard Watson Gilder like visiting him and painting something into the painting. Moran allowed him to paint and put a little I don't even know what he was putting in there. I think a little figure of himself, and Moran was like, nice, and then he painted a tree over it. There's this sort of great. And as an American Studies PhD student, I was super excited to write about the creation of that painting because it's so iconic. And, lots of people don't know the history of it. And so, but that too had to get, a little bit cut down and reframed so that we were seeing Hayden interact with the painting more than Moran himself. But that was an extremely fun chapter to write. I was super into that. So yeah, it's very sad when you have to cut material, but you always save it in another file just in case you need it later.
Yeah. I that was some of the best advice I was given when I started my PhD work, was create an orphan sentence paragraph chapter file where you just store all the children that can no longer this is terrible, but store all of your baby sentences that you can no longer make it into the main thing, but you aren't like ready to quite delete yet.
Exactly.
I really, I was struck by your description of Thomas Moran's paintings, as well as how Congress funded the arts and his art, and I was thinking about the other day about the consequences of, if, as this hypothetical, what if Congress had not funded that? What if they had, not purchased his painting? What if they hadn't? And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit more, because I know you and I have talked about this in the past, but the idea of using of nationhood through art and nationhood through the press, and how the United States was trying to understand itself through Thomas Moran and through these paintings and other forms of mass communication as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because we've talked before about Truman Everts, who opens the book. So I hope you enjoyed that. But I mean, and so 1870 and 71 was really this time when Yellowstone just sort of emerged in the American imagination. I mean, there had been all of these rumors about it, but no one really knew, except for indigenous peoples, what was actually in there. There had been some scouts and some guides who had gone in, and Coulter had gone in there, pretty early on in the 19th century, but no one believed their stories. I mean, they just seemed completely insane. And it really was mass communications. It was Scribner's Monthly. It was newspapers that began to talk about Yellowstone, began to report with that Langford, the Washburn expedition, the fact that Truman Everts got lost for 37 days on that expedition and then was miraculously found. I mean, this just created all the conditions for Yellowstone to emerge in popular culture as this place that needed to be understood and needed to be fully described. And Americans in this moment they were looking for that, right? They were really interested in travel narratives, in travel logs and stories. And of course, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad made the travel across the continent possible for many more people, that it would, it was still expensive, but it would not take you very long to get where you needed to go. And so this prompted just this huge outpouring of travel writing. And then ultimately, this is how Hayden described Yellowstone and got the word out about Yellowstone, was not only through his report to Congress, which was printed and then distributed to a lot of different people beyond just Congress, but also he wrote this big article for Scribner's Monthly, which followed up the article by Langford and the article about Truman Everts, detailing his horrible experience and peril in Yellowstone. And so they're this great like triumvirate of Yellowstone pieces in 71 and 72 in Scribner's Monthly, which was a new magazine for middle-class readers, and it was reaching this huge audience. And then all of these newspapers are just reporting on that. They're taking out excerpts from Scribner's, they're describing it. They tracked the Yellowstone expedition. Whenever Hayden or any of his scientific guys would write letters back to newspapers, they would print those and reprint them across the nation. So you could find people were really interested in this, and they were interested in a way. I mean, I don't know if you nerded out on this the way that I nerded out on it. I think it was February 2021 when the Perseverance rover landed on Mars, and like there was a whole, I love space stuff. So I was like, wait, what? They're going to land? What? And so I was watching the countdown, and when, it landed, and they would have these moments, and someone would report and say, parachute has released, and everyone would cheer. And it was a great thing to be watching in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of kind of political chaos. But it's this amazing scientific achievement. And I got like teary-eyed watching this footage, right? But it was something to be proud of. And I imagine that this was a similar kind of thing for many white Americans, probably predominantly, during this moment, tracking the Yellowstone expedition and seeing them go in and come out. and then report all of these amazing natural wonders. And then to see the photographs and the illustrations based on the photographs, and then to see Thomas Moran's paintings, like just phenomenal proof of this extraordinary and unique landscape, in America and in the American West. And in the book, I'm really arguing that, in this moment when the country's trying to come back together, they're really searching for a kind of unity, and they find it in Yellowstone. They find it in an idea that's been in play for most of the 19th century called nature's nation, that the United States may not have, the storied past of Europe and all of these ancient ruins, but what we do have is Niagara and the Grand Canyon and Yosemite and Yellowstone. And these are places no one else has, right? And so this is what Hayden was finding, and this is what he proved, is that Yellowstone had the largest geothermal field in the world. And, even though they hadn't discovered a couple of the other ones, but I think Hayden knew that this was unusual. I mean, they knew about Iceland, they knew about New Zealand, but they were nothing compared to these, thousands of geothermal features, which he couldn't even, he recorded a lot of them, but certainly not all of them. And he knew he had to come back. But this is what he was looking for. And this is why Americans just sort of had this amazing appetite for pieces about Yellowstone, because they were searching for this kind of thing.
Yeah, I was struck by the role that art played, and the role that like this nation building through nature played. I was also really interested in the way that you described the literal politicking. And the thing that always surprises me, and I was reminded of this as I was reading through your very final chapter, is how small the window in time was that the Yellowstone Act was able to be passed. And then after it was passed, and this is why I think one of the reasons that framing it in Reconstruction is a really a boon to the book and a boon to understanding Yellowstone history, because then there's this change, right, in politics, and Yellowstone funding sort of goes away. And so I was wondering if you could talk about how you managed to really bring out the richness and the and be able to even slow the time down so quickly to be like, hey, now we're going to talk about this very short period of time. So I was struck by that.
I really got into the lobbying for the Yellowstone Act, all the debates about it. I mean, the only other person to talk about the debates over the Yellowstone Act in any detail was Aubrey Haynes in like the magisterial 2-volume history. He's really the only one. I mean, everyone else who talks about Yellowstone in conservation histories or as part of larger projects, the passage of the act is almost a given.
Yep.
And it was not a given. Like, it was not unanimous. The only reason it passed is because the Republicans had such a huge majority in both the House and the Senate. The objections to it were that it was federal overreach, an argument we still have today. I mean, both these arguments are still with us, right? About public lands and federal lands, how to use them, federal overreach, and then also taking lands out of development, completely messes with white settler land rights. It messes with preemptions, with squatter rights. And these are the heart of the American dream. And so there were even moderate Republicans who were mad about that and who didn't vote for the Yellowstone Act because of that. And so I had some really nitty gritty detail of like people running back and forth and in the Capitol and arguing back and forth, and newspapers getting into the fray and making these arguments about the Yellowstone Act, thinking that it was all going to be, basically a money grab for the Northern Pacific Railroad and other railroads, because Jay Cooke was lobbying for it, and so there was a lot of debate about that. But it was this moment where the Republicans had control. They were in a moment in their politics where they were embracing federal power to kind of produce things and create things for the benefit of the people. And they were doing that in the South and in the West. But then very quickly, I mean, once Democrats start to reemerge in 1874, that's abandoned. And we don't see the creation of another large national park until 1890, which was, again, the only other time that the Republicans regained control of the presidency and both houses of Congress. So, and then, even then, I mean, that was the creation of a couple. Benjamin Harrison was like, okay, let's do it. But it really took Teddy Roosevelt to really vault the national park system kind of into being and to really expand it and to create federal reserves and national historic sites and everything that he was able to do because of the Antiquities Act. So this was not a given. And the fact that it happened in 1872, actually, you had the question about what surprised me. And I think that was one of the things, like that this actually was a very strange moment in a lot of ways. And I think also you were discussing, like, would it have happened? Like, when would it have happened if it didn't happen now? And I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure when. I mean, certainly not until the 1890s. And maybe... Right. I don't know. I mean, there was the precedent of Yosemite from 1864, but that was giving lands to states to manage. It was not federal land taking. So I don't know. It's a really interesting question to ask because there was a substantial gap. And Congress didn't seem too interested in doing much for Yellowstone after 1872 either. There's like very underfunded for both Langford and Philetus Norris, really, in those the first kind of 2 decades of Yellowstone's existence as a national park.
Yeah.
Sorry. Mel has returned. So is it time for attendee questions?
Well, I think we might want to open the floor up to some questions from our attendees. Right. I haven't seen anything pop in yet, but while we're waiting for some people to think about what questions they might want to ask, the one that I have brewing in my mind is, I know you've had to do research on all sorts of different places to try and track down these stories. Was there a source or a resource that you either really wished you could have found and didn't, or one that you found it and it just made everything open up to you?
Well, I still can't believe that no one can find Hayden's field notes from this expedition. He kept everything. I mean, when you go to the National Archives, the great thing about researching a federal project is that they have to save everything, right? So, I mean, there is a massive collection for the Hayden expedition and for all subsequent and other expeditions out in the field also at this time. So just a massive amount of material. There are receipts, there are logbooks, there are all these things, but his field notebooks are nowhere. And he didn't deposit them in any sort of archive with his personal papers. So I mean, if we could find those, that would be awesome. I don't know if he destroyed them and just figured that the pieces that he wrote and the report that he wrote were good enough, or if they're somewhere stashed in the Smithsonian and we have no idea. I also would have loved to get into the Smithsonian to see some of the items they sent back, because they sent 45 boxes of specimens. And I know for a fact there are at least 2 bird specimens that are in existence in the collections. And I have digital images of some plant specimens that Robert Adams, the botanist, collected on the expedition, but they're extremely hard to find online. And then of course, most of them are inaccessible. So I really wish I could have gone to see them just to be able to have that experience of seeing what they brought back. I mean, we can see obviously the photographs and the paintings. I also have not ever seen Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone in person. It's a massive painting. It's like 8 feet by 12 feet. Apparently at the moment, it may still be at the Department of the Interior, but they may have loaned it out. But I'm going to try and track it down. I'm going to DC this summer, and I'm going to be on the hunt for a Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone so I can finally see it in person. But otherwise, I would say the most helpful, I mean, obviously, I wish that the pandemic had not happened and I would have been able to go and see, to Jay Cook's personal papers and to go look at more Hayden stuff in Ohio. But the most helpful sources for me were the digitized sources that the Library of Congress put together, the Congressional Serial Set, which just has everything and is word searchable. So I put in Sitting Bull and I found him and references to him proliferating in reports from like the Department of Mining, the Department of the Interior, the US Army, the Department of War, like all of these departments are suddenly talking about Sitting Bull in this moment, which was a great thing to realize because, you know, he had been a leader of his people for a long time before this, but he really emerges in the American consciousness as a threat to American projects in the early 1870s. And you can see it in all of these reports. And so to be able to have that tool was pretty amazing. And it was also amazing to have newspapers.com, which is actually a paid service, but I would recommend it for all historians because their collection is insane and it is massive and it is word searchable, date searchable. And with that, I could put in Hayden Expedition or Yellowstone Expedition, give it a range of dates, and then I could just see how national newspaper, like local newspapers across the nation were reporting on the progress of the Yellowstone expedition. And that's an amazing thing to know that there's that kind of response and that kind of interest kind of all across the nation during this period.
Thank you. Another one that I was thinking, I know you talked about a little bit about things that surprised you, but was there a connection, like a timeline connection that just beyond what you've talked about that just, I didn't really realize didn't put it together that those things were happening? And Kerri, the same thing for you, if there was anything as you've been researching this era as well, that kind of stands out, like we forget that these people and places are connected.
Are happening at the same time. Yeah, I mean, for me, it was to realize that the same US Congress who gives Hayden $40,000 almost on the same day inserts a rider in the Indian Appropriations Act, which basically says we will no longer make treaties with Native nations. Which means they no longer recognize their sovereignty. And this is a major kind of change in US Indian policy that a lot of people don't pay attention to. I mean, Reconstruction scholars and Reconstruction West scholars definitely do. We're like, hey, this is an important moment, but like, it's not super well known. So that was important. It also, I thought it was kind of wild, and this is why I had to include it, that the Great Chicago Fire was in October 1871, and Hayden actually walks through the ruins of Chicago on his way back from the expedition. And this is another kind of huge national event, a huge disaster that prompts a nationwide response. So I thought that was an interesting kind of connection and also coincidence that these things are happening kind of at the same moment. I don't know, Kerri, what do you think?
I was struck by the Chicago thing too, and this is a conundrum that's faced, I think, by many authors and many historians, especially ones that concentrate on events either in the East or the West. But we can see these interconnections and we can see these networks between people, places, events, but it's hard to sort of connect those without making like a massive tome that can, be a doorstop on a bank vault. So the Chicago fire was one that I didn't keep in the front of my mind. And when I was reading it, I was like, oh yeah, how was it that time? That's a really good point. Like, oh yeah. The other thing that I appreciated about the way you described how they traveled on railroads is, when we're sort of picturing, and this is often a narrative that's told about a lot of the Yellowstone stories, if not many Western stories, is there's this sort of rugged fur trapper-esque story. And when you bring in the railroads, that sort of upends that a little bit in a way that I think is really interesting to think about how Yellowstone fits into this modern story.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Yeah.
That's all I got off the top of my head right now.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a huge point, that there are these modern technologies, the Transcontinental Railroad, photography, and then also a lot of scientific instruments, and then also kind of magazine production. All of these things are working together to kind of bring Yellowstone into the picture. And yeah, you do think of it, and this is just a sidelight, but this was the thing. I mean, Kerri, you probably saw on Twitter, like I was watching the show 1883 and I was just screaming at the television, like, you could have taken any of like six trains, like, and it would have been the same money. Like, I don't understand why you are taking a wagon train from Dallas, Texas to Montana. It makes zero sense. Like, no, but anyway, I digress. But I think there is a question in the chat of why did I pick Spartanburg for the book? Yeah, I mean, I was really interested that the KKK investigations and the trials were going on at the same time as the Hayden expedition and the push to pass the Yellowstone Act. And so I liked thinking about those two things side by side and what can we learn about how they're connected. And Spartanburg was one of the county itself, and then the town were the sites of some of the most extreme violence against Black men and women who were trying to take up their new rights. And I also found in the testimony, because the subcommittee went down there and did interviews, and they produced these amazing reports. I mean, verbatim testimony from Black Southerners, and this just huge cache of amazing sources that we have for this period. And one of the most amazing stories in there is Lucy McMillan's. And I was very aware that the rest of the book was pretty dude heavy. These are worlds of men, the worlds of exploration and investment banking, and warfare to some extent, and then also science, and then the US Congress, obviously. And so throughout this, I was like searching for women who would like emerge as strong voices for leaders in their community. But the women kept coming to the fore, and then they kept dying. I was like, I've got so many dead women in this. And so to find Lucy McMillan and to find that amazing story that she told, and that she just was so steadfast and so brave to go on her own and tell her story when she could have been, killed for it. To do that, I thought was just an incredible moment. And so I wanted to be able to showcase her and to have a woman's voice also pretty clearly in this moment. Again, I had a much longer segment on her, the back and forth between her and the amazingly named Philadelphia Van Trump, who's a Democrat and a rabid racist during this period. And he tries to go after her, and she's having none of it. Like in that testimony, she's just like, nope, you are wrong. This is the story. And her words make it into print, and they come down to us today. And so of all the stories, there were many stories that were incredible, and many brave people who testified in the KKK investigations and then in the trials. But I really felt that her story was one I wanted to to include. So that's why I take the reader there for that moment. And it is part of that larger argument about what the federal government is doing at this moment in Reconstruction to bring the North and the South and the West together in the years after the Civil War.
Do any of our attendees have any more questions to drop in the chat or in the Q&A? I'm not really seeing anything else popping up at the moment. So I do want to thank you both for coming and spending some time chatting with us and sharing your experiences as historians and the experience of writing the book with us. Attendees, if you missed any section of this conversation, it will be posted to our YouTube channel along with other conversations with authors that we've had over the last year or so. So you're welcome to check those out. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Is there anything else you guys would like to say to wrap up?
I mean, I'll just say thank you to everyone who came. I will be out in Bozeman in real life in May, signing some books at Country Bookshelf, and then also participating in the big biennial NPS scientific conference, and giving a lecture named after Aubrey Haynes, which is like the most amazing honor ever. So I'll be happy to be out there. So let me know if you are going to be around. And thank you to Kerri for coming on and having this great conversation with me. I can't wait to meet you in real life again.
Okay, yeah, I enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you everyone for coming, and hopefully we'll see you all in the future.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.